Welcome back to Advice for Grad Students. I'm Phil Haun, your host, and today we are joined with Josh Shifrinson, an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Most importantly, an alum of the program. Josh, welcome to Advice to Grad Students.
Hey, Phil, thanks for having me in.
It's good to have you back. I want to put a disclaimer that the views expressed today by both of us are our own and not reflective of our institutions. And today's topic is discussion on different types of theories. So, Josh, what made you interested in talking about this very deep subject?
Well, I wanted to sound smart. And as importantly, in graduate school, we're often taught about what it is to do research, but we're not really taught about the different types of research one can produce, the different types of theories that one can produce. And I think today, at a time when there's debates over prescriptive versus explanatory theories, the role of empirics versus just pure theory in the IR space, just talking about the different types of theories one can come up with is useful.
Okay, well, we've got some time here. So what advice do you give?
Well, when I look back upon graduate school and what I learned with Ken Oy, Steve Van Ever, Barry, and others, it struck me that there are really three different types of theories that one can produce in a dissertation, right? Two are more notable than the third. The least common is what we could think of as largely deductive theories, right? These are theories that are really based on existing IR theory, and the point of your research is just to showcase in almost mechanistic fashion examples and cases that just prove this theory to be correct or false. This is often associated with the paradigm wars of the 90s and the 80s. It's not particularly common these days, but you still see some work come out that has this flavor to it, that it's largely deductive, and the research is just there to prove a point that substantiates this other theory, and away we go. The second type of theory that one can do is what we can think of as almost entirely inductive or mostly inductive. Which is often based on deep existing knowledge of some kind of evidence or some kind of data, where you're really just trying to say, okay, what is this data that I know an example of? Let me craft a theory to explain basically this case or small set of cases, and away we go. And that's not wrong. Explaining a couple of big important cases is hugely important, especially if you're able to abstract back and put this evidence in conversation with social science concepts. The risk, of course, one runs is that people say it doesn't travel very far, it's not generalizable, or new evidence comes to light that disproves a largely inductive theory, but it's not wrong. The third type of theory, which I think is the kind that MIT heavily promotes, is what I think Phil and I would call interactive theories, right? Where you have a little bit of evidence ahead of time that you sort of know. You have a really good grounding in IR theory, so you develop a theory that might explain this thing that you sort of kind of know. You go ahead and do some research. You discover that the evidence is much more complicated. The moving parts are far more rapidly moving than you expected. So you have to revise the theory a little bit. You then go test it against some other data set, preferably from a different case or set of cases. You discover that theory needs to be adjusted a little bit more. You go back and revise again. And at some point you stop. Now, I want to be clear here. This is not trend line fitting, right? Because you're not trying to get a perfect one-to-one match, and you have to acknowledge that the interactive effects can be real, and that other research might disprove it. You're still subject to the generalizability problem. But the point is that there's research that blends both a firm grounding in IR theory with really deep empirical knowledge as well. And you're trying to marry the two together, acknowledging, of course, that you're trying to explain a complex social reality, and no theory can ever do that. So it's never going to be a perfect one-to-one match between your theory and even revised evidence over time. And so I think most dissertations are going to fall into that latter category at MIT these days.
Okay, well, you've provided a good typology of theories, and you begin with the third one to talk a little bit about developing those theories. And so I'm going to call you out. Can you give us a little bit of specifics? I really like your book with Cornell. Did you go through the same process?
Oh, yeah.
Developing that theory?
Yeah, so my book, thanks for the shout out, Phil. That book began as my dissertation, and it has a long and tortured history. But I still remember, since he was at my first colloque, my original theory looked nothing like the book I produced. I originally had a theory that was based on defensive realism and offense defense theory in particular, explaining the conditions under which a relatively rising state would kick the snot or not out of a declining state. I then went into the archives of the H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan archives to look at American foreign policy towards the Soviet collapse, and discovered that none of my argument worked. The DV was different than I expected. The causal processes were different than I expected. And I had to step back and say, okay, how do I explain this using what I know about IR theory? And I ended up having to go back to the drawing board and drawing from some assumptions based actually in offensive realism, not defensive realism. I was able to get some traction going in explaining this case. Now, of course, I didn't want to stop there because you don't want to just have a N of one, a theory that explains one case, albeit important. So then I went back and I started looking at the American response to the British decline and the Soviet response to the British decline as another case of rising and declining state relations, and discovered, somewhat surprisingly, that this theory which I had revised to help explain the end of the Cold War case could also explain this case of British decline. What was really interesting there is I had expected the case of Anglo-Soviet relations to actually be the one that would disprove my theory that I have to revise again. And instead, it ended up being actually mostly confirmatory. In some cases, some of the best evidence I had in the book to showcase the theory in action. And so at that point, I knew I had a theory that was totally different than what I began, that I had to modify a couple of times, but which seemed to explain several really big, important cases. And of course, when I went ahead and tried to publish the dissertation as a book, I got further questions about how does this travel to other cases. And so I went ahead and did more research looking at 19th century cases of rise and decline, and discovered that I had to modify the theory again in different ways, combine some variables, remove some variables, simplify some causal mechanisms and beyond, and ultimately ended up in the theory that you see in the book that Phil was referencing. So it's a very much an interactive process of revise, resubmit, adjust, add more data, see if it travels, and beyond.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, that sounds very similar to my own experience, which was start with a single case, use that case to build up an inductive theory, then begin testing it on other cases,
right,
modifying it, simplifying, or finding the important pieces, variables that moved until you have something that travels. And it sounds like to me, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, that you now have a model that's, particularly for great powers, that somewhat gives you insight to what's going on today, right? So if it works well, you'll have something that you can be able to not just produce research on historical cases,
right,
but able to say something about the current and future security environment.
No, that's exactly right. And this raises another very important point about the types of theories we can think about. We often make a distinction between explanatory theories and prescriptive theories, right? Things that explain the world and versus things that give recommendations to how the world could move forward or what policy might look like. And that's what Phil's getting at with my argument today. Does my theory help us understand and perhaps provide insight into contemporary great power politics? Does any theory provide insight into any contemporary policy issue? And in a way, if a theory is good, almost any theory can speak to policy. The distinction between explanatory theories and prescriptive theories, I think, is largely artificial. The question is really where the explanation and prescription come together. For example, my work on great power politics provides insights into how a rising China may behave towards the United States, and I think offers some insights into what the United States can do to keep any Chinese predation at bay. Other theories may not have that sort of prescription. They might simply be able to say, look, if China is a democracy, we'll use democratic peace theory. If China is a democracy, then it is less likely to go to war with the United States, even if it rises. Now, that might not seem prescriptive, but if you're in DC right now, all you hear are concerns over the rise of China, how threatening it is to the United States. The insight that democracies don't fight one another is actually a prescription to say, don't stress out as much about this horrible end of the day outcome. So all explanatory theories can provide prescriptions, just a matter of where they enter into the policy conversation. Just as, by the way, all prescriptive theories can often be abstracted back into explanatory theories at some point.
Yeah, you just took me back to an ISA where the chair was Bruce Gentleson, and he gave me the big question that I always ask myself now, which is, so what?
Yep.
Right? If at the end of your research, somebody should ask, so what, you've got to be able to explain it.
Yeah,
Well,
that's right.
What, You got any last thoughts as we close up?
I mean, no, I think I could go on for another hour about this topic, but for the sake of a 10-minute briefing, let's keep it short and sweet.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Josh, for being with us today on Advice for Grad Students. Take care.
Take care now. Thank you.